Module 21, Analyzing Fractions. The materials you will need for this lesson are fraction strips, paper, pencil, and lesson notes. If you have to make your fraction strips, you're going to need paper, marker, and scissors. You can use your fraction strips from a previous lesson, or you can actually use the link that I provided to use online fraction strips. The I can statements for the lessons that we will be doing for Module 21 are I can understand two fractions as equivalent or equal if they are the same size or the same amount on a number line. I can recognize and generate simple equivalent fractions. I can explain why the fractions are equivalent by using a visual fractional model. In our previous modules, we learned that we can cut shapes into equal fractions. If we look at the pentagon, it has 5 sides. This pentagon is cut into 5 equal parts. So if we think about what we've learned so far about fractions, we know that these 5 equal parts would be called fifths. The fractional unit would be fifths. If we are going to talk about one of our pieces, that would be a unit fraction. So if we think about this yellow piece here, and we wanted to write it in word form, we would write it as 1/5. If we were going to write that yellow shaded fraction in number form, it would be 1/5, or 1 out of 5 of the equal pieces. And we read that as 1/5. This chart has the fraction language for many of our fractions. You can use it to help you when you're doing your work today. In the first 2 pages of your lesson notes, you're going to find some fractions, pictures of fraction models, and then you're going to have a chart that goes with them on page 2. What you're going to do is label the shaded parts in the table on page 2. So you're going to look at page 1, fraction model number 1, and it is broken into 3 equal parts. So those parts would be thirds. There's 1 shaded part. So on your chart, next to number 1, you're going to write in fraction words 1/3. And then you would write in fraction numbers 1/3, 1/3. You can stop the video and work on your first 2 pages of your lesson notes now. The new fraction term that we're going to be working on this week is equivalent fractions. And the definition would be equivalent fractions have the same value, even though they may look different. They are fractions that name the same amount or part. And here's an example of equivalent fractions. 1/2, 2/4, and 4/8 are all equivalent fractions. And hopefully you can see in that word equivalent, it sounds similar to the word equal to you. So we're going to be talking about different fraction pieces that equal the same amount of a whole. And we're going to explore that today. Now, if you need to make some fraction strips because you're going to need them throughout the lesson, then you can stop the video and you are going to use a piece of paper, marker to label, and then you'll need scissors to cut them out. And we're going to need at least whole, halves, thirds, fourths, eighths, and sixths. And if you already have made them from a previous lesson or you have some printed out, you can use those today. Also, I put a link in the lesson that has some online fraction strips, and you'll see them today in the lesson we do. So we're going to begin with equivalent fractions for one whole. Remember that whenever we're making fractions, we always start out with a whole. It could be a whole circle, it might be a whole different shape like a square, or it could be a fraction bar or strip like the one on the screen and the ones you have in front of you. So take out your one whole piece, please. And my question to you is, how many halves would it take to equal one whole? And you can go ahead and use your fraction bars to find how many halves it would take to make one whole. When you line them up, it takes 1/2, 2 halves to make one whole. And this is what the fraction would look like. 2/2, which we would read as 2 halves. So we could say that 1 whole is equal to 2 halves. As we go through different fractions that are equivalent to 1 whole, I want you to think about and pay attention to the numerator and the denominator of the fraction that is equal to 1. How many thirds would it take to equal 1 whole? Go ahead and line those up and see if you can figure out how many thirds it would take to equal 1 whole. So we would have, if we count them, 1/3, another third would be 2/3, and another third would be 3/3. 1/3, 2/3, 3/3. So 1 whole is equal to or equivalent to 3/3. Same amount. The pieces look different. There are more pieces when we have thirds, but the amount is the same. Take a look at that numerator and denominator. Hope you're seeing a pattern. How many fourths would it take to equal 1 whole? You can use your fraction pieces, but you might already know if you noticed a pattern with the numerator and denominator. We're talking about fourths this time. How many fourths would it take to equal 1 whole? If we count them, we would have 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. So 1 whole is equivalent to 4/4. So do you notice that every time that we're trying to create 1 whole, the numerator and the denominator are the same? Because remember, this number at the bottom, the denominator, is how many equal pieces I have. This is how many pieces I've cut that bar into. I cut that bar into 4 pieces. So if I want to have the whole bar, I'm going to need all 4 pieces. So any fraction that has the same numerator and denominator is going to be equivalent to 1 whole. So think about that pattern as we look at these fractions here. Which fractions are equivalent to 1 whole? Take a look at the fractions that we have listed here. Which ones would be equivalent to 1 whole? Let's see if you can see that pattern. Okay, let's check and see if you were thinking right. Did you say 5/5? I hope so. 8/8? Any others? 4/4 is correct. All of those fractions would equal 1 whole. So besides having equivalent fractions for 1 whole, we can actually have equivalent fractions to other fraction amounts. So we're going to explore fractions that are equivalent to 1/2. So you can use your fraction strips right now in front of you, or if you want to use the online and follow along with me, you sure can. So I'm going to put my 1 whole right up here. And then I'm going to put a 1/2 because that's the amount that we're working with. All right, so let's start seeing. We want to find some equivalent fractions. This is where you can explore. You don't necessarily have to start a certain way. So I'm going to see if I can get thirds to equal 1/2. So, well, I can see, and I remember from comparing fractions that when the denominator is bigger, the pieces are going to be smaller. So thirds are smaller than halves. So let me see if I can get another one. Does that equal 1/2? Are those the same amount? No, can't use thirds. I'm going to put those back. Try your fourths. Let's try fourths. It looks like I have a winner. 1/2 and 1/4, 2/4, 1/4, 2/4 are equivalent. They are the same amount. So fourths works. I found one match. All right, let's try fifths. You think fifths? Before we start, do you think fifths are going to work? Let's try. Remember, we're trying to have the same amount as this 1/2. We want it to end at the same place. 1/5 is not enough. 2/5, do you think it's going to work? 3/5, is it the same amount as 1/2? Does it end in the same spot? No, it's too much. All right, let's get rid of those. That didn't work. Try 1/6. Let's try it. 1/6. You can count them as we go. 2/6. 3/6. It worked. Our 3/6 worked. I'm noticing something about those fractions. I hope you're noticing something about those denominators. So the 1/3 didn't work. The 1/4 did work. The 1/5 didn't work. The 1/6 worked. I wonder if 1/8 is going to work. Make a guess. Make a prediction. Let's count them as we go. 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8. We found another winner. All right, let's go back and talk a little bit about that. So we figured out that 1/2 is equivalent to, here's our 1/2, 2/4, 3/6, 4/8. So what do all those denominators have in common? Discuss that with your learning coach. I hope that you notice that the even numbered denominators worked with the 1/2. They did. Here's something else I want you to think about. We're talking about half, right? And I want you to just think in your mind if I asked you for half of something that you have. For example, if you have 4 pieces of candy and I asked you, can I have half of your candy? How many would you give me? Half of 4 is 2. Look at this fraction, 2 out of 4. If you had 6 pieces of candy, what would half of that be? That's right, it would be 3. What if you had 8 pieces? What would half of that be? That would be 4. So notice these different patterns that are happening when we're talking about our halves. And remember that you can always use your fraction models to help you. So your fraction strips, and in this case we have fraction circles. But notice that all of these fractions cover the same portion of the circle. And that is what equivalent fractions do.